Hey everyone, this is a piece by Rolf Hecker titled "The Mega Project: An addition between a scientific claim, an addition between a scientific claim and the dogmas of Marxism-Leninism." This discussion is supposed to serve as an introduction to the Marx-Engels Gesamtausgabe. MEGA. Not only as this project exists today, of which more than 47 volumes have appeared, but also as a project with a history of its own. In his article, Uncovering Marx's Yet Unpublished Writings, Kevin Anderson has already provided a brief overview of the history of this edition. As an editorial associate of the MEGA for approximately the last 20 years, I will deal with some questions pertaining to this edition that have arisen from the discrepancy between its claim to scientific status on the one hand and the dogmas of Marxism-Leninism on the other. And this is published in 2001. Although the MEGA was a project of the communist parties of the German Democratic Republic and of the Soviet Union up until the collapse of state socialism in the two countries, MEGA was never the official ideology's favorite child. MEGA never corresponded to the pure Stalinist style of the ruling doctrine. How is this to be understood? We can find an answer to the question in the history of the project itself. The idea of publishing the entire literary estate of Marx and Engels in a collected edition goes back to 1911. In 1911, in advance of the reversion of Marx's literary estate to the public domain upon the 30th anniversary of his death, a number of Austrian and German social democrats got together to consider how a collected edition might be undertaken. The agreement they reached among themselves for the, quote, Vienna edition, as it became known, came to grief not only at the outbreak of the First World War, but also due to the limited ability of the German Social Democratic Party, SPD, or of the publishing company associated with it to finance such a project. The failure notwithstanding, since then the fortunes of the collected edition of Marx and Engels have been tied to the exigencies of the party line. The brainchild behind the Vienna edition was David Borisovich Ryazanov. The Russian had the best contacts to German Social Democrats, especially to Karl Kautsky, and Ryazanov had become well acquainted over the years in German, Austrian, and French archives of the history of Marxism in the 19th century. It was Ryazanov who knew the literary estate of Marx and Engels the best. Following the 1917 revolution in Russia and Lenin's coming to power, Ryazanov had another chance to begin work on the collected edition of Marx and Engels. In 1921, Lenin entrusted Ryazanov with the founding and direction of a Marx-Engels Institute in Moscow. 3 years later, a Marx-Engels Gesamtausgabe, the collected writings, was commissioned by the Communist Party and by the Communist International. I believe Ryazanov was a Menshevik, as was Isaac Ilyich Rubin, another important Marxist in the early Soviet Union. Under the direction of Ryazanov and in close collaboration with the Frankfurt Institute for Social Research, under the director Karl Grünberg, who Ryazanov knew well from the time of his exile in Vienna, and with the agreement of the German SPD, work was begun on cataloging and photographing the literary estate of Marx and Engels. Representing the Marx-Engels Institute in this work was the Menshevik Boris Ivanovich Nikolaevsky, who had been expelled from Russia. The Nikolaevsky collection is at the Hoover Institution at Stanford. In addition, Ryazanov had among his co-workers a number of non-Russian specialists. Germans, Austrians, and Hungarians, including Ernst Chobel, his assistant responsible for the MEGA. Ernest Chobel. his name is spelled CZO with an accent BEL. So I don't know if I'm saying his name right. It says that Ernst Czobel lived from 1886 to 1953 and was a Hungarian historian, translator, diplomat, and politician. From 1905, Ernst Czobel was an active Social Democrat in the Hungarian Social Democratic Party. In 1919, Ernst Czobel became ambassador of the Hungarian Soviet Republic in Vienna and was arrested in Budapest the same year. From 1922 to 1947, Ernst Czobel lived in the Soviet Union and was imprisoned again from 1936 to 1945. Czobel was, among other things, deputy director of the Moscow Marx Engels Institute and a contributor to the first Marx Engels Complete Edition. His older brother, Bela Czobel, who lived from 1883 to 1976, was an expressionist artist. He was married to the writer Sarolta Lányi, who lived from 1891 to 1975. And that entry was from German Wikipedia. In the article, it says Ernest Czobel. In the German Wikipedia, it says Ernst Czobel. I think it's Ernst Czobel is the correct one. Anyway. Where am I? In addition, Ryazanov had among Ryazanov's co-workers a number of non-Russian specialists, Germans, Austrians, and Hungarians, including Ernest Czobel, his assistant responsible for the MEGA, who are active both at the Marx Engels Institute and as correspondents in Germany, Paris, Brussels, and London. In 1927, the first volume of the MEGA appeared. In connection with the imprisonment of the well-known economist and associate of the Institute, Isaac Isakovich Rubin, a one-time Menshevik, earlier in 1931, Ryazanov too was retired. Following the assumption of the directorship by Viktor Viktorovich Adoratsky, the Institute's new course became clear. Viktor Adoratsky. Vladimir Adoratsky. One second. Sorry, I'm looking at Adoratsky, trying to find something for him. It says It says, in December 1929, during the celebration of Joseph Stalin's official 50th birthday, in fact, Stalin was 51, leading Soviet academics were expected to produce articles praising the leaders' contributions to their disciplines. The veteran head of the Marx Engels Institute, David Ryazanov, and foremost Soviet philosopher, Abram Deborin, failed to comply, but Adoratsky stepped in with an article published in Izvestia, praising Stalin as a great Marxist theoretician. Early in 1931, after a case had been fabricated against Ryazanov, Adoratsky took Ryazanov's place, becoming head of the merged Marx Engels and Lenin Institutes. Adoratsky also headed the Department of Philosophy in the Communist Academy from 1931 to 1936, and the Institute of Philosophy of the USSR Academy of Sciences Institute of Philosophy from 1936 to 1939. Forced to retire through ill health in 1939, Adoratsky was replaced as head of the Marx-Engels-Lenin Institute by M.B. Mitten. In July 1941, when the institute was evacuated as the German army approached Moscow, Adoratsky pleaded that he was too ill to travel in a freight car, for which he was expelled from the institute and denied his salary. His daughter appealed to Mitten to intervene, but he refused. Adoratsky was then evacuated with other members of the Academy of Sciences to Alma-Ata, where he fell seriously ill. After being discharged from the hospital, Adoratsky was allocated unheated rooms where he had to live and work in the kitchen. He returned to Moscow in 1943 and died there in June 1945. He was buried at the Donskoy Cemetery in Moscow. Back to the text. Following the assumption of the directorship of Viktor Viktorovich Adoratsky, the Institute's new course became clear. The MEGA and Ryazanov, with his cultivation, were from the beginning a thorn in Stalin's side. Now the Institute would have to serve the propagandistic aims of the party more obediently. It was amalgamated with the Lenin Institute and placed directly under the supervision of the Central Committee. It would have to lead a sharp attack upon the German Social Democrats. This is implemented in a new popular edition of all 3 volumes of Das Kapital, directed against Kautsky's edition, but also in the first publication of letters that Ryazanov was purported to have kept secret. On the other hand, at Stalin's order, documents concerning Marx's illegitimate son, Frederick Demuth, vanished into the vaults of the archives. Of course, though the first MEGA, of which 13 volumes appeared in 1941, had its merits in many respects, it followed the standards of international editorial practices and strove for authenticity and completeness of the text, inclusion of variants, etc. There were also problems with the editing. These had to do with the uniformity of the arrangement of the text, modernization of the orthography, chronology, problems of dating, and with the annotation. Footnote. Ivan Kapp, Frederick Demuth. New evidence. There's a footnote here. Frederick Demuth. New evidence from old sources. One second. Anyway, sorry about that. I was looking that up to see if I could find that book online or that article. Where am I? When in the mid-1930s, the proposal was circulating among the staff of the MEGA to expand the edition to 80 volumes and to establish a 4th edition where the excerpts and notebooks would be published in full, in place of the previous practice of summarizing them, The completion of the edition was in sight. Though initially members of the staff were let go under the pretext of, quote, economizing, end quote, Following the show trials in the middle of 1936, another purge of the Institute took place, and no foreign co-workers remained. At the end of 1938, the documents needed for the volumes then being worked on were consigned to the archives. Allowed to continue was only the work of the the work on the Grundrisse, der Kritik der politischen Ökonomie, Foundations of the Critique of Political Economy, published in two parts in 1939 and 1941 for the first time. Most likely well known is also the story of Bukharin on the trail of the literary estate. Jesus Christ, I'm used to seeing Bukharin and trial together. Bukharin on the trail of the literary estate of Marx and Engels in Paris and Copenhagen in 1936, on Stalin's direct order, with the aim of obtaining possession of it in its entirety. The effort failed. The papers were acquired through the offices of the Amsterdam Institute for Social History for the German and SPD and German and SPD and parenthesis. The assignment formed one of the charges against Bukharin during his show trial. He was accused of having initiated a conspiracy with the Menshevik Nikolaevsky, I guess that's how you say it. The fate that befell Bukharin and then Ryazanov, shot in 1938, also struck almost all the staff of the MEGA, who, as time went on, either vanished into Stalin's gulag or were shot. Later, the few survivors hardly ever spoke about these events, even after the 20th Party Congress of the CPSU. The topic remained utterly taboo in the Eastern Bloc. With the end of the Second World War began a new chapter in the history of research on the Marx-Engels corpus, and in the Marx-Engels corpus's publication. It was made possible by the accessibility of the material. The Marx-Engels-Lenin Institute took advantage of the Soviet occupation in East Germany in order to requisition the necessary documents from the archival collections of the Prussian State Archive, among other sources, concerning both the life and works of Marx and Engels and the history of the German workers' movement, for instance, the literary estate of Ferdinand Lassalle, along with valuable books. It was also successful in acquiring original documents from Engels' family archive. In Moscow, early in the 1950s, a new second Russian edition of the works of Marx and Engels was initiated. This served as the basis for the German edition, 1956-68, and consequently for editions in many other countries, the collected works among them. The Berlin Institute for Marxism-Leninism initially had to orient itself strictly according to the Moscow line. The necessary documents came from there, and not all the material requested by Berlin was actually made available. There were always problems with the publication of particular writings. Thus, some texts by Marx were excluded from the Marx-Engels Werke. For instance, those concerning Russian secret diplomacy or the manuscript on the Polish question. Others were removed from the chronological arrangement and only published later, in supplementary volumes, as for instance was the case with the, quote, Ökonomisch Philosophischen Manuskripte, end quote, the 1844 manuscripts, which did not accord with the concept of Marxism-Leninism. Only slowly was the Berlin Institute for Marxism-Leninism able to develop its own approach to research. When it did, the idea resurfaced of publishing a historical, critical, collected edition of the works of Marx and Engels, following the 20th Party Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. In 1956, for the first time, the attempt was made to prepare a new MEGA. However, when Walter Ulbricht, head of the East German Party, approached Nikita Khrushchev as to its possibility, Ulbricht's inquiry remained unanswered until 1964. Only then did the project assume a concrete form. It became clear that 1. The old MEGA could not be continued. 2. Work on the new edition was to take... Excuse me. Where am I? 2. The work on the new edition was to take place both in Moscow and Berlin. And 3. The tradition of party institutes taking on the editing would remain untouched. It took a while before the Berlin and Moscow institutes began to collaborate in a spirit of mutual trust. Eventually, the staffs understood the task at hand better than the directors did, not to mention the party leaderships. Thus it was, for instance, that the underlings kept the information to themselves over a long period of time that, if the principle of comprehensiveness were not to be abandoned, the MEGA would embrace at least 130 volumes. A project of 100 volumes was spoken of instead. Great importance was attached to editing according to a uniform set of editorial guidelines. In a test volume appearing in 1972, both these guidelines and the organization of the planned 4 editions were laid open to discussion. Responses from around the world led to greater precision in the work, in the course of which, furthermore, complicated questions of editorial procedure kept coming up, which had to be settled by supplementary guidelines. However, in some, the guidelines corresponded to the standards of international editorial practice. In this regard, it is particularly important to emphasize the following principles of the new MEGA. Absolute completeness, including the excerpts, notebooks, and the letters of third parties to Marx and Engels, strict preservation of the chronological arrangement, the most up-to-date presentation of variants, exact reproduction of the original text, including the preservation of contemporary orthography, and extensive annotation. Orthography means the standardized way of spelling and writing words in a language, including rules about punctuation, capitalization, and other conventions. It's essentially the system of symbols and rules that define how a language is written. Back to the text. Establishing these principles represented a great advance, and they had to be pushed through against considerable resistance, above all in the Moscow party headquarters, especially if they stood in direct contradiction to the official propaganda of the party. The aim of finding support in Marx for the political and economic decisions of the party leadership is certainly difficult to square with the goal of a historical critical annotated edition. In this connection, it should be mentioned briefly that the volumes in the 1st and 4th editions were not worked on in chronological order, along with the simple reason of the specialization of the teams working on the individual volumes. It was desired that the most important and well-known works appear as soon as possible in the MEGA, including the previously unpublished economic manuscripts, as well as the first volume of Das Kapital. The reception of the MEGA by the Marxist-Leninist social sciences in East Germany up until 1989 was varied. On the one hand, the existence of a complete edition of the works of Marx and Engels was well received, and on the other there followed a very hesitant analysis of text that had been edited in a proper historical critical way, and of the manuscripts and excerpts published for the first time. The MEGA did not conform either to the propaganda line or to the ideology then current. It was seen as an academic edition offering no incentive for party theoreticians to begin again with the study of the text of Marx and Engels. The present debate over the relation between Marx and Engels, that is, whether they were in accord with one another in their conceptions or not, with reference to Marx's manuscript of the 3rd volume of Das Kapital, which is in MEGA 242, and Engels' edition of the same, which is in the Marx-Engels Werke 25, would not have occurred without provoking considerable controversy among the readers of Marx and Engels before 1989. The comparison of these two texts certainly gives the orthodox or dogmatic interpreters of Marx no cause to rejoice. The MEGA's principle of completeness, followed from the start, has now revealed the different conceptions of Marx and Engels on the depiction of the capitalist mode of production. For instance, a difference in their conceptions of the so-called simple production of commodities, quote, simple production of commodities, end quote, and capitalist production, but in other aspects of their conceptions as well. Differences and also, of course, common ground can be found between the two. However, one can't speak of the identity of the two friends' positions, as the ideology of Marxism-Leninism supposed to be possible. In having provided a solidly documented case against that misconception, the MEGA is playing an important role in doing away with the old dogma altogether, an effect that would have been inconceivable before 1989. Through the cooperative and intensive work of the MEGA staff, which up until 1989 included 150 co-workers at the Berlin and Moscow Institutes of Marxism-Leninism, and in work groups at the University of Berlin, Halle, Leipzig, Jena, and Erfurt, it has been possible to publish yearly between 3 and 5 volumes. By May 1991, a total of 45 volumes have been published. Parenthesis, it shouldn't be forgotten that as personal computers first entered our lives in 1987, the composition of the text and the printing took a lot of work. In parentheses. Most of the staff were certainly proud to be able to work on such an important edition, though it can't be denied that they were considered party workers, and the MEGA was considered a weapon in the ideological struggle. While they were working on a historical critical edition, and thus were bound to yield results other than those customary in Marxism-Leninism, their self-deception endured. Consider above all the ideological ballast of the introductions, but also some of the annotations as well as the index of subjects and the annotated name index. In parentheses. Although the attentive observer will recognize a certain development in critical detachment in the development of the work. Since the first publication in 1975, the MEGA has also met with a large response beyond Germany. Less so in the USA, parenthesis, no volumes were ordered in this country, in parenthesis, than in Japan, parenthesis, where 800 copies of each volume were sold, in parenthesis. In some countries, one of the MEGA's aims was quickly fulfilled. There were translations of previously unpublished manuscripts, for instance, the translation of the, quote, Economische Manuscripta, end quote, of 1861-63 into Russian, English, Italian, French, Japanese, and other languages. Members of the staff of the MEGA were invited to conferences on Marx throughout the world, held not only by communist institutions but also by universities and academies. The edition itself, however, was cut off from the influence of international debates and from advice on editorial questions. Parenthesis, for example, concerning the sequence of the manuscripts, in parenthesis. Only a cold response was given to critical comments from Marxist circles in the West, parenthesis, from Maximilien Rubel or Wolfgang Fritz Haug, for instance, in parenthesis. As Marx and Engels were always treated as an affair of the party, and until 1989, with the dissolution of East Germany, the staff of the MEGA was confronted with the question of how the demands of an academic edition were to be met. The staff members called for a more academic edition and also one with greater international cooperation, not entirely to be expected after a historical period largely determined by, quote, ideological class struggle, end quote, parenthesis, wars both hot and cold, in parenthesis. Thus it was and is not self-evident that the MEGA would or will be seen as one historical critical edition among others, nor that the literary estate of Marx and Engels deserves and ought to be treated in this way either. That's why it is important that the further editing of the MEGA not be placed under any party's banner. At this point, the history of the editions of Marx and Engels stand at a new crossroads, which Jürgen Rohan will report on. That's the end of the piece. Thanks for listening.